Seberg is the new film starring Kristen Stewart as actress Jean Seberg, who got involved with the Black Panther Party in the 1960s and subsequently became a target in the FBI's COINTELPRO project. I'm Kevin Jacobsen, writer at Gold Derby, here with the screenwriters of Seberg, Joe Shrapnel and Anna Waterhouse. And my first question to the two of you is, in this film, there is this moment where there's a journalist who's asking Jean Seberg what it is that made people fall in love with her after Breathless. So kind of in that spirit, I'm curious to know from you what it is that made you fall in love with Jean Seberg and wanting to tell her story.
Well, obviously, like many people, Breathless was the first time I'd seen her on screen. And I think it's the combination of she's so quintessentially American, and yet she fits into that sort of cruel Parisian world as well. And she's just got this energy, which is very, very difficult to define. And I'd never seen anything like it before, anything like her performance before. Love the film. Obviously, it's sort of one of the films I watched very early on, and it started a great love affair of mine with film generally. And then quite a few years ago now, 15 years ago, a friend and collaborator of mine, Kate Garwood, who is one of the producers on the movie, showed me an article about Jean's life, and it was in a magazine. It wasn't particularly in depth, but it did refer to the COINTELPRO, the program that ultimately surveyed her, and we write about in the script. And I was really intrigued. How did this gamine beauty, this sort of strangely undefinable actress who was in so many odd movies, as well as being in that very classic and well-regarded movie, how did she end up being a major target of the FBI? And sort of ultimately destroyed by that program. And that began my obsession with her, and the research began, and then Joe and I got together. I'd started writing the script at that point, and I mentioned it to Joe, who I'd met relatively recently, and he was a screenwriter working on other things himself independently. And he said, I can't believe this. I've always wanted to write a film about Jean Seberg. He'd come at it from a very different angle to me. I'd been very interested in, as an engine for my film, the FBI's investigation into her, because I felt that the public don't necessarily know who she is. And also I felt like it was a really interesting, dramatic way of finding out who she was on screen during the story of our film. And Joe and I started talking about it, started working together on it, and ultimately it began our collaboration. We're married. We've worked together for 15 years. It was this kind of amazing coincidence that brought us together. And I think all of the research Joe had done was more personal to Jean, wasn't it? Joe had a book on his shelf called Diana, the Goddess Who Hunts Alone by Carlos Fuentes. And he was a guy who had an affair, a Mexican writer who had an affair with Jean. And he'd written this novel, which was loosely sort of disguised version of their affair. And I hadn't read that book, and Joe gave it to me and said, you've got to read this. So the combination of the angles that we'd come at was a very sort of, I think, very fortunate
and
meeting. Really,
like you, I got obsessed with her from Breathless, from the still of Breathless. Before I ever saw the movie, I saw that still of her in the Herald Tribune T-shirt with Belmondo on the Champs-Élysées or wherever they are. And I saw the movie early on, very young, too young to sort of fully grasp it, but you pick up its energy. And as Anna says, her energy is just something else. She's the first sort of amazingly modern actress in that movie, in this very sort of modern movie. And I had become obsessed with her as an actor. And then I'd found out that my grandmother, who was also an actor, had made a film with her, the second film she made with Preminger, called Bonjour Tristesse. And so I spoke to my grandmother when she was alive, and my grandfather about Jean and sort of, I'd come at it, I felt I had a really good grasp of who Jean was in my mind. What I didn't have was a story. And so when Anna pitched me her version, I was furious with envy, and thrilled and really excited to start working on it together.
And so the film is called Seberg, but it's not necessarily this cradle to grave traditional biopic. It's very centralized on this one big important section in Jean's life. So what was the thought process of wanting to tell just this one part of her life story?
We have written quite a few, as you might call them, biopics, films about real people. And we always come at these stories with the same criteria that you would come at any story. We feel you can't rely heavily on the fact that it's a real person just to sell the movie. You have to be rigorous about what story you're telling, what's the engine of the movie, what's happening. A life is, by definition, vague and difficult to pin down, and it's episodic. So I think if you're working on a TV series, I mean, maybe you've got the space within that genre to explore different pockets of someone's life more elegantly than if you are working in a feature film context, which is a temporal medium, and it's got a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's got propulsion. And I think for us, the story of this young girl being plucked from obscurity, becoming famous, the movie that she became, she was cast in, Joan of Arc, was a flop. So it's a sort of an odd story. She becomes famous suddenly, and then she's not really that well regarded. And then she sort of reinvents herself again in France. And then she was constantly reinventing herself. What we found really interesting about her was she comes from Marshalltown, Iowa, the middle of America, the middle of, so different, so far away from where she ended up in Paris. How does that happen to somebody? And we felt that all of those questions could be answered in our structure. So you understand where she's come from. You understand the causes that are important to her. I mean, she joined the NAACP when she was 14 years old, which, to grow up in Marshalltown, Iowa, at that time, it was a big statement for her to have made. She didn't care what people thought, and that carried her through her whole life. And I think the essence of that comes through in the film that we wrote. And we didn't need to show her aged 14 joining the NAACP, etc., to get that message across. So I feel that was really, and as I mentioned before, the FBI's investigation into her life gave us a very good conceit and a way into her life, a way to tell the story of her life to an audience who may or may not know who she is. And I think, Benedict Andrews, the director, has talked a lot about this, but the sort of cinematic conceit of being watched, that was something that we were very keen on trying to achieve. Obviously, clear influences in films like The Conversation, those 70s political thrillers that Joe and I just love. Sort of yes, watched a lot of those movies. We sort of soaked them up, and that was our intention. It was funny because, obviously, as you know, a script goes through so many different versions of itself, and as the sole screenwriters from 15 years ago to now, we wrote many, many, many versions of the script, and it went through various incarnations, and it nearly happened a few times before with a different team, and then it came together with this beautiful team of people. But, we had all sorts of subplots in different versions of the script. We had a whole plot on the UCLA campus for the wife of Jack. We had a lot more of the civil rights movement in there. But as these things happen, the script becomes more and more refined, particularly for a period film of this nature. They're very difficult to get made, and you never have enough money and you never have enough time. So what ends up happening is there's a distillation of the story. And I think our conceit originally to tell the story within this shorter period of time was very helpful in that regard. It meant that we could actually tell the story with the resources that we had to do so in the end.
And I think, I mean, all I'd add is that with any story, or certainly with a character, you can, if it's a rounded and vivid character, you can extract a single drop of their DNA, and you should be able to extrapolate the rest of them from it. And I think what Anna had done brilliantly in choosing these 2 years is not only put Jean right in the middle of one of the most sort of fascinating, conflict-riven periods of recent history until now, and allow her to be completely alive in that, and allow, as you said earlier, allow the structure of the film to provide you with the information that you might need about her. And I feel
it's interesting. You mentioned earlier in your earlier question that interview, the scene in the middle of the movie where she's interviewed, and that was almost verbatim an interview she gave. We tried really hard. There's very little about her. There's very little of her personally, because I think, obviously in those days, celebrities and actors would be interviewed in a much more, defined way. It wasn't, for your sound bites weren't everywhere. So we tried to find as much as we could, and we tried to get as much of her voice into the film as we could. So that scene is very, very faithful to her words. And also the scene when she first meets she goes to Hakeem Jamal's house. And a lot of her ideas, the real ideas that she articulated, we tried to put into that scene so that we were being as genuine as we could to her. She's not here to defend herself. She's not here to explain herself now. So we wanted to be as faithful to who we believed she was.
That's an interesting point, actually, because she, unlike actors today, there's no direct
means of communication.
There's no direct medium between an individual who has something to say and an audience to listen. Now we have Twitter. Now we have many sort of outlets, and so her persona is constantly being shaped. So there's a lot written about her, and you can watch her on film and you can understand so much just from her performances. And you can learn the facts about her.
You can extrapolate, but you can't know that much. And so that's why we wanted to just put as much of her as we could in the movie. But Joe's grandmother, who he referred to as Deborah Carr, and I think it's really interesting. Obviously, you knew her very well, and the difference between her as your grandmother and the sort of cover articles that she, I can't remember what was the magazine that she was always in, and there were sort of these ridiculously staged pieces
those
about her
50s
beautiful life,
magazines.
And it was also, sort of manicured and controlled. And now I think
Jean was kicking against that even then.
Totally.
Is what there was.
We've got some lovely pictures of Jean and Deborah together, and you can just see a generational difference in how Jean is sort of, kicking against it. She's trying to express herself at a time when she still didn't have a voice. And then this FBI investigation and the sort of, I won't say the beginning of fake news, because that's as old as time, but, fake news that she's literally being lied about, and on purpose. And it's just infuriating. But the fact is, now we live with that. We assume that's happening. I mean, if I was a well-known actress, or actor, I would be incensed, about most of the things that were written about me. I'm not being a screenwriter.
Well, in addition to being the screenwriters of the film, you also executive produced. And Joe, I believe this was your first time executive producing, from what I read.
That's true. Absolutely.
And I think you had one other credit before that, but what was that experience like of not only writing the bones of this film, but also kind of just helping it come to life as well?
It was great.
The best way to do it. I think a lot about this. As a screenwriter, you're sort of godlike in the early stages of the process.
Until you hand it in.
Yeah, you invent the world. You create characters, you create moments, you create plot, you create worlds, and you do all that often just from your mind. And then suddenly you get into production and you completely lose control of the process. Usually, and that's not always a bad thing. And in fact, film is a collaborative medium. The only reason that we love working in film so much is because it's a collaborative medium. But it's an interesting thing to, at a certain point, just go, okay, you have to let go. Actors are coming along. Actors have their own ideas about how to interpret those characters that you've written. Directors have their own ideas about the story they want to tell. Editors have their own ideas. So suddenly you're in a kind of, it's a difficult thing to go from being completely in control to being not at all in control. So I think executive producing for me or producing in general is an absolutely perfect balance to screenwriting. I started off as a producer kind of by mistake. I did it a bit at university and was successful at it, just sort of not despite myself, but I was surprised at a quick success in producing, in this case, West End plays. And so I started doing that before I started screenwriting, knowing that I really wanted to be a screenwriter. So I feel very comfortable producing. I really love being around the set. I love being part of the process of picking teams. And on this, we were very much part of that process. I would say once the camera started rolling, we were much less involved because it was such a quick shoot. And you have to let the director take over at that point. And
the inestimable Fred Berger.
And Fred and Kate Garwood were there the whole time, and we were very, very closely in touch with them, but we weren't there. I think we were there for 10 days or 2 weeks. And also being a screenwriter on set is horrific. I mean, no one wants you there. We actually, not this movie, but another movie, we nearly got kicked off the set because they didn't know who we were. We turned up and got invited, and I think the line producer was like, "Who are you? Can I see your ID?" And started calling security.
That's the big difference. When you're an executive producer, you don't get thrown off the set. But to work with that cast and that crew was just a pure joy, and to watch that team come together.
It was amazing because
it was a real privilege.
There was very little money. No one got paid a lot at all. I think Kristen even drove herself to set. Like it was sort of really down to the bone. And so to get that amazing group of people attached to the script was just unbelievable. And then the film actually happened, because a lot of the time you go, is it going to happen? Is it actually going to happen? And then they started shooting it and we went, okay, it's happening. This is incredible. I mean, that cast I still can't believe it. That lineup, we have a photograph of the Venice Film Festival where the first screening was, and it's just all those actors on that red carpet, and I still pinch myself. It's really amazing for a little film like this to have
but also,
and also Rachel Morrison.
Michael,
I was going to say,
I mean,
Michael,
just an extraordinary team came together, and so as executive producers, you got to be more involved in that coming together than you ever would just as a screenwriter. Yeah, and having Rachel and Michael, when they both attached themselves, we're okay. We're dealing with something that's going to, it's going to be such a classy production, and that was so exciting for us to watch happen after all that time.
Yeah. And so when you were finally able to see the finished product, I mean, what did you ultimately think of how Kristen Stewart portrayed Jean ultimately? Like, was there anything she brought to the table as an actress that you were maybe even surprised by? So daily.
Yeah.
It was this extraordinary sort of mind meld that happened from the word go. And in fact, it started with the hair, because everyone knows the Jean Seberg hair. And so there was a lot of discussion about what the haircut was going to be. And I'm temporarily forgetting the hairstylist's name, but the decision was made to, sort of adapt it. It was somewhere between a Kristen Stewart haircut and a Jean Seberg haircut. And that was early on in the process for the first camera tests and everything. And that became, as we were watching dailies, you saw that that's exactly what was happening with Kristen, that she was somehow channeling Jean. It's not a straight impersonation, but it's unmistakably her, not just the look, but the sort of energy. She found her inside herself, if that's not too pretentious
she did,
to say.
No, it's absolutely, that's exactly what she did. She found Jean, but because we all felt that Jean was this incredibly modern creature when she was alive and working, Kristen has that energy. It was just extraordinary to watch her, because she just turned this character into herself, and yet.
But I've never seen her.
No, I've never seen her like this before. We were watching dailies. That was another perk of being an executive producer. We actually got copied into the dailies, and even at that stage, we were just blown away by it. And every take was just,
some new
tingly
piece of magic would emerge. Yeah, I mean, I'm obsessed with the performance, and I'm obsessed with everything from the clicking fingernails to the. I mean, she's
such a brilliant young actress. She's so good. I think she's got such a massive career ahead of her. She makes interesting choices. She's not like anyone else. She's so herself, and she feels so comfortable. She seems so comfortable as herself right now. And I think that all fed into her being able to just give herself to this. And she really did. Like, she was really committed every day. It was a short shoot and full days and very emotional. And that's tough, and she was just absolutely there the whole time, supported by this incredible cast. So that's, and I think as well that she had an amazing connection with Benedict, the director, who's brilliant with actors. He's worked a lot in the theatre, and I know many very well-known actors and very excellent actors who really love working with him. And so I think she really sort of trusted him and was able to go to places that,
there's a
felt
bravery
safe.
and a courageousness in the performance and in everything that is breathtaking, really.
Yeah.
So just a delightful surprise. And you were aware something special was happening early on, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, she's terrific in it, as you can tell.
Yeah, I think it's one of her best performances for sure. So, well, with that, thank you, Joe. Thank you, Anna, and best of luck as Seberg opens up on December 13th. And for the rest of you watching, just hit like and subscribe for more great awards season interviews, and head over to goldderby.com to make your predictions. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.